Kia ora whanau, ko Mark toko ingoa, ke te noho o ki o te tahi a te roa. Hi all, my name's Mark from Christchurch, New Zealand. I'm a clinical psychologist. I recently gave this talk towards psychological consilience, unity and integration at the National Conference of the New Zealand College of Clinical Psychologists. And this was well received. I've had requests to present it again. So I thought I'd just record it. The audience for this talk is my fellow psychologists and psychiatrists mainly, so there's a bit of jargon and assumed level of knowledge. But of course, the subject is of relevance to a much wider audience, everyone potentially. So here it is for anyone who is interested to view and share it. What is this all about towards psychological consilience, unity and integration? Well, the what and the why. Let's start with the why. Here are some problems in psychology that are challenging for new trainees, but also for more experienced psychologists if you are really dutifully trying to do best practice. So the first one would be that we have this abundance of models and theories in many subfields, but a lack of integration. And this means you tend to get duplication. So the same phenomena with different names, confusion, complexity, but a lack of depth to it. And the nature of academia is it tends to favour narrow expertise, which we do need, and I cite a lot of it in this talk. But it favours this over broad interdisciplinary knowledge, and this creates a problem for integration and recognising duplication. Next, we have this scientifically invalid diagnostic system, the DSM, OCD, where the categories are dominated by expert opinion from 50 years ago. A bunch of guys sitting around a table, essentially, rather than the latest 50 years of scientific progress. And people are familiar with the DSM, we have research on it, but this shouldn't keep us stuck with a broken system that impairs both client care and research. And to be clear, much of the content of these categories is valid, not the way it is grouped into categories. And also we do have this problem of epistemic injustice, will be one term for it. How we know what we know. Just as one example, consider the use of the word disorder, when what we're really talking about is someone who is ordered by threat in their phenotypic development. So we have these stigmatizing or misleading accounts of human experience in too many instances. So in an attempt to address some of these issues, I wrote this paper titling it Towards Consilience, because of course it's not a final answer, but I do believe it offers some useful directions in all of this and in a Aotearoa New Zealand context. And for reference to everything I say here, you'll find in the corresponding section of my paper with citations. Further comment on the DSM briefly. Yes, some categories are worse than others. Borderline, for example, so vague it obscures more than it illuminates, to quote Roger Mulder, head of psychiatry at the University of Otago, or was. But nonetheless, as revealed by diverse scientific methods, the issue is that while phenotypes within these DSM disorders exist, the way they're grouped together is too often nonsense from a scientific perspective. So while we may still need to use these diagnoses as codes to ensure treatment access, perhaps communication sometimes, we really now should be doing better if we can. So what are some leading alternatives to the DSM over the past decade? Well, first of all, the DSM itself acknowledges these problems and introduced this concession of cross-cutting approach. So this is assessing symptoms that cut across disorders, but nonetheless, the categorical system remains dominant there. There's also the research domain criteria, RDoC, from the National Institute of Mental Health in the US, the largest funder of mental health research in the world, so they've abandoned the DSM in favour of these biological and neurological categories, with the hope this will improve outcomes in the longer term. So this is currently more of a research framework rather than a practical application, though it still has some use, I believe. There's also the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology by a large international consortium of researchers, and this is a dimensional model based on patterns of sign and symptom co-occurrence. It's the power threat meaning framework from the British Psychological Society, which is focused on those factors and universal evolved responses to threats. There's various cultural approaches. For example, in the paper I talk about the Mai Hunter model here in New Zealand. And of course we have psychological formulation, which is often not an alternative so much as something adjacent to these above approaches. Now, I believe there are valuable contributions in all these perspectives, so I don't want to choose one over the other. I want the best of much research, and I want to find convergent points of agreement, because if so, that suggests we might at least have greater confidence in those conclusions. And also, of course, if you have two models which conflict, what do the other 3 or 4 say? This way you can perhaps get towards some important truths. So what I'm advocating for here is consilience, which is a position where we want a unity of knowledge, a position that knowledge is unified, and that robust models integrate converging evidence from multiple fields. And the goal then is to detail these patterns of convergence and connection across psychophenotype domains. By a psychophenotype, I'm talking about a pattern of observable psychological characteristics of an individual, particularly as they relate to cognition, behavior, sociality, emotion, that sort of thing, that arises from the interactions of genes and environment, which is all a lot to say. So I say psychophenotype or pattern. And I chose to focus on the following subfields because they're large, they've got well replicated literatures. Firstly, psycholexical personality, so looking for personality trait patterns in language. Next, cross-cultural, looking at shared values across societies and cultures. Next, psychopathological, mental health systems of the nature I've just described. Biological, evolutionary and neural systems and theories. Functional, traits aiding survival and thriving. And the application of this, the intended application, is to provide a heuristic for clinical formulation, as has been requested by some of my psychologists in a review of this paper. But a more general goal was simply to enrich existing formulation approaches by summarizing connections between phenomena with reference to a New Zealand context. And jumping right in then, and having done this, here are 6 high-level domains I believe provide a robust organizing principle for clinical psychology, and they're presented here in Murray and English, and as a guiding star, just selected with the positions, and the star is common cultural motifs. So I'll briefly run through these domains. Aroha altruism is the central domain for social kindness and attachment. And this is because this is the fundamental basis for the development of other domains. The head of the star, Asamai intelligence. This is for cognitive mapping, reasoning, and perception. There is an arm of the star, Ringatoa Nui, temperance, for behavioral control, self-regulation, task achievements. There is an arm of the star, Arititanga, equality, for social fairness, reciprocity. And the legs of the star, Toa, courage, Pharaoh, hope. These refer to emotional systems, because emotions, simply put, are energy for motion. It takes you away from threats and towards rewards. Now you'll see these emojis here. That was ChatGPT who came up with them. I tried to get ChatGPT to make some of my slides, but it was unfortunately terrible at this, despite being the paid version and being repeatedly prompted. So I gave up on that, but kept its emojis. Instead of this terminology, you could say that these are a cognitive, a behavioural to social and to emotional systems, or you could say these are expansions of core personality domains, or RDoC or HiTOP categories, or human virtues, and this wouldn't be too far wrong. However, these are not any one of these fields, but rather an integration of them all, or at least an attempt at that. So I didn't want to misrepresent it by using terminology from just one of them. Instead, I just chose some terms that are based around function, core essential functions, and mnemonics that reflect two big things psychologists do. We care, aroha, and we teach things. And these are the things we teach. But of course, you can ignore these terms, use whatever you want, as long as you're clear about what you're communicating, and you can match it to whatever cultural background. If you can think of better terms, let me know. What matters more scientifically is the pattern of deeper empirical and theoretical relationships between phenomena, which are summed up in this table in the paper and expanded on in the article. Don't worry about reading this, it's in the paper. This is most of clinical psychology, integrating leading models at a reasonably high level. So personality, cross-cultural values, RDoCs, HiTOP, PTMF, DSM, Maihana model, even some psychotherapy examples, as a heuristic for formulation or to enrich existing formulation approaches. I believe this also matches what psychologists often try and do implicitly with formulation, even if they can't state all these connections explicitly. And so I've tried to lay out this helpful overview of likely connections in the paper of how things fit. But why would I suggest this? What's the evidence this makes any sense at all? Here are some points of evidence briefly stated. I'll start with personality. And when I graduated as a clinical psychologist, personality did not have the importance to me that it now does. But I was also dissatisfied with my level of knowledge, and so I started reading the literature. Probably about 1,000 papers a year over the first 4 years. And in doing that, I noticed personality kept cropping up and being linked to everything, and that my understanding of personality was limited and wrong in some important ways. And so it shifted from being something peripheral to something central. And this view has only become stronger as I kept up with research developments over the past decade. So what is personality in psychology? So first of all, there's the psycholexical hypothesis, and this is that because languages evolved, they will contain words for patterns in the world, including personality characteristics, that are vital to human function and well-being. Therefore, if you want to understand what is important about humans to humans, you study these patterns. Psycholexical models are also the dominant system of personality in the literature. The Big Five, or the five-factor model, the most referenced in DSM discussions of the 2010s when it was being revised. And psychologists will be familiar with these domains: openness, intellect, conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, extroversion. But a now 20-year-old improvement on this is the HEXACO, or Big Six model, which utilizes some better methods, including cross-cultural language analysis and frequency of use algorithms, looking for the maximal emergent factor space. And it adds a sixth factor, honesty, humility, which is related to but distinct from agreeableness. And character traits such as integrity and fairness fall into this one. We also have New Zealand norms for this Big Six. So with age, people increase in conscientiousness and honesty, humility on average, and decrease in neuroticism and extroversion. There's no ethnic differences once you control for other factors like economic deprivation, which not surprisingly increases neuroticism. And otherwise, there's a slight sex difference with women scoring on average a bit higher on most of these except openness. So why does this matter? Well, firstly, these personality traits predict health outcomes in various ways. So that's important. And next, we can change personality with psychotherapy. For example, a 0.5 standard deviation improvement in neuroticism in 6 weeks. Other interventions like mindfulness can increase openness, improve conscientiousness, and so on. And next, most psychopathology has a relationship with personality, and this relationship is often stronger 2 to 3 times than links between personality and so-called personality disorders in the DSM. So, for example, neuroticism links with threat system disorders like anxiety and trauma. Conscientiousness links with self-regulation disorders like addictions. And a conclusion from this is that personality disorder in the DSM sense is a nonsense concept when everything relates to personality. To quote a paper I cite in my article, either all disorders are personality disorders or none are. I'll repeat that, either all disorders are personality disorders or none are. Keeping in mind I'm not a huge fan of the word disorder without further caveats to that. Much of what falls in the personality disorder category of the DSM would be better termed interpersonal or relational psychopathology. So that might be a better term. Next, I mentioned HiTOP, Hierachical Taxonomy of Pathology by this big international consortium of researchers, which is a big empirical review of DSM data, essentially trying to replace this 50-year-old expert view. And so that reorganizes the signs and symptoms into dimensions, hierarchical dimensions based on empirical factors. And a very clear finding in this is that the main HiTOP spectra are personality divisions, and these also link to RDoc. So whatever the problems with the DSM, if you take the content and subject it to modern scientific analysis, the key divisions you get are personality divisions. And this is HiTOP, the top level divisions there, the third row, the multicolored columns. Let's look at that, simplify that. So it's been matched to the big 5 personality, but as I argue in my paper, perhaps it's a better match to the big 6 personality model. So thought disorder maps onto openness intellect, disinhibited externalizing maps onto low conscientiousness, antisocial externalizing maps onto low honesty humility in the big 6 model, detachment, the disaffiliativeness of social domain maps onto low agreeableness, internalizing fear distress onto low reverse neuroticism, and I argue for moon mania being related to extroversion. In the Big 5 model, mania is kind of interstitially or between factors, but I think it matches like this. Can be debated regardless of whether you use the Big 5 or the Big 6 here. It perhaps also reveals gaps or ways things should be better located by considering both personality poles. For example, we know that disinhibited externalizing disinhibition is a problem, low conscientiousness. But what about over-inhibition or high conscientiousness, like clinically problematic perfectionism? And we agree that low honesty, humility, and antisocial behavior is a problem. But what about too high honesty, humility, and the humiliation, the victimization you see in relationships sometimes? So psychologists know these are potentially serious psychological issues to diagnose or formulate, even in the absence of formal DSM diagnostic categories for them. And in the HiTOP, these can load, for example, on neuroticism, but arguably that is a consequence rather than representing the core phenotypic aspect. Another limitation of the HiTOP, like the DSM, as well as potential gaps in content, is that it is focused less on context, meaning, or function. And that's a criticism that has been taken up by the British Psychological Society with their Power Threat Meaning framework. And so they propose this as another alternative to the DSM. And the focus is on understanding much distress, not all of it, but a lot of it, as universal evolved responses to power, threat, and meaning, depending on an ecological context. In other words, it's asking, what have they done to survive in various situations? For example, biological health, there's illness and injury, and social support, there's abuse and exploitation, and economic resources versus experiencing poverty or instability. And what about environmental and legal safety versus violence or discrimination? And what knowledge and values do they have in terms of education versus misinformation or indoctrination? Because in all of this, luck is supremely important. We do not choose our genes or the environment we're born into. This shapes and arguably determines our personality or psychophenotypes. The more we understand causation, the less room there is for some very naive views of agency and free will. And there are some really important moral and societal implications from this too, around how we hold people responsible for both perceived successes and perceived failures. Lastly, in the evidence I'll talk about here is that personality also converges with cross-cultural and character research in important ways. So there have been efforts to identify virtues or character strengths that are valued cross-culturally, so across all cultures. And so the expression of these may vary, but there's a common core to them. And the main body of work here is from positive psychology, and this work has identified these 6 main virtues, which are emphasized explicitly or thematically across all major world religions, major non-religious philosophies, plus oral traditions, ranging from those of Maasai in the African savannah to the Inuit of the Arctic Circle. And in this work, originally 20 years ago, they didn't do the formal empirical work on organization in the sense of a taxonomy or relationships to other fields like personality. And some sub-facets of these traits, which I've not listed here, are a bit mixed up, I think. But they still did pretty well, and you may be noticing a pattern occurring again here. And recent research has looked at some of these relationships, and here are some findings. Firstly, virtues align with personality. They largely reflect positively valued personality development that is culturally universal. And there's some good evolutionary reasons why that would be so. And even if you're not talking about virtue, moral evaluation is implicit in personality judgments anyway. We look at pre-European Mare Fukutoki or proverbs, find many supporting virtues, and important to look at pre-European ones here, which illustrate that Mare were aware of these same concepts prior to contact from Europeans. Also, if you reverse psychopathology criteria, you often get virtues. So, for example, the reverse of antisocial traits is prosocial ones. The reverse of hopelessness is hope, and so on. Thus, all of this suggests a convergence and potential organizing framework between models of personality, psychopathology, in cultural systems of meaning and value. So this brings me back to this position of consilience and advocating for this unity of knowledge and robust models that integrate converging evidence from multiple fields. And the goal of this then is to provide this heuristic for clinical formulation or to enrich existing formulation approaches. And central to that then is the 6 psychophenotype domains. And I'll look at number 1, a brief overview of the domain, its function and description. I'll look at associated personality domains, some key features of that domain also. I'll look at some patterns of potentially maladaptive psychophenotypes from a low pole and a high pole, which can be a useful way to think about them, and some brief examples of interventions also. A caveat to this is that this is at a high level, and you can make that more precise as needed and as is indicated in a particular case. In reality, these domains, they're highly integrated, they're sometimes overlapping. There's interstitial phenomena, or perhaps some phenomena that sit outside of this. But actually, most psychopathology arguably falls within these 6 domains, and thus this is a useful way of looking at things. And of course, if you have difficulties in one domain, that's likely to be associated with troubles in other domains, but these tend to be heterogeneously associated. That being said, I'll now look at these domains. So the first domain, atamai, intelligence and perceiving, the cognitive mapping system. So the function of the system is learning, exploration, and navigation of reality. All human needs and adaptive behavior depend on competent information processing. And the personality domain that relates to this is openness intellect, where openness is more about aesthetics, novelty, and an interest in complexity, while intellect is more about the organization and processing of information. And this second facet relates to perceived intelligence and should include consideration of IQ. Now, of course, IQ has traditionally been considered separately from personality, but we're being integrative here, and empirically and theoretically, this is where it fits in. So another feature then of this domain is that we use language and we're storytelling animals. In stories shape identity, they justify behavior, they transmit and shape culture. And problems we encounter include stories which are too rigid or absent or inadequate, or there's overwhelm from unstoried experience like early relational trauma. So therapy often includes reflection and flexible narrative construction, the ability to tell new stories, more powerful stories. What are some problems here? So as discrepancies arise between cognitive mapping ability and the ecological demands one finds oneself in, individuals may seek help or they may be labelled as needing it. At one end, you can consider excessively low activity from lack of education or indoctrination or conditions like intellectual or learning disability or dementia. Or at the other end, you get this pattern of excessive cognitive mapping, too many connections being made, like in hypersaliency conditions and epiphania, delusional beliefs, psychotic experiences. And openness is positively, in fact, negatively associated with psychoticism. Some examples of therapeutic interventions here. Cognitive, third wave, many others. But I thought as an example, sometimes psychology is prone to going with whatever the latest fad is or overcomplicating things, missing some really powerful interventions that are still great despite being 50 years old. So I quote Beck here, Aaron Beck, Psychological problems may result from commonplace processes such as faulty learning, making incorrect inferences on the basis of inadequate or incorrect information, and not distinguishing adequately between imagination and reality. So that's the first domain, Atamai intelligence. The next domain, Ringatonui, temperance and achievement, behavior control system. Function of the system is behavioral regulation, self-control, and achievement, which is essential for human needs of agency and competence. The personality domain is conscientiousness, which is linked to self-regulation, attention, aspects of executive function. An important theory here is life history theory, how early environments shape behavioral strategies and the investment of behavior over time. And the pattern is that in unstable ecology, where resources are inconsistently available, fast strategies tend to be favored. Where you reach maturity earlier, there's a greater risk-taking and short-term focus. Whereas in a stable ecology, a slower strategy is favored with delayed gratification and long-term goals. And this makes sense because a focus on short-term investment occurs when you don't know how long you'll be alive in the environment you find yourself in. Versus an environment that tells your biology there's probably opportunity to develop some really deep competencies over a longer time frame. We also see evolutionary mismatches between modern environments and our evolved appetites. So, for example, for calories and novelty, and we see addictions where our reward systems can become hijacked by short-term focus to the detriment of longer-term opportunity. So potentially maladaptive extremes of regulation and control: disconstraint at one end, impulsivity, attention deficit, addictions, bulimia; overconstraint at the other end, overwork, perfectionism, compulsions, anorexia. Some examples of interventions: psychoeducation, executive skill training, adjunctive stimulant medication, for example, for attention deficits, traumatic brain injury; environmental strategies, such as modifying cues and contingencies and reinforcement schedules; motivational interviewing to increase the commitment to long over short-term goals; and exposure response prevention to help reduce compulsive behaviors. Next, we have the first of two social domains, arititanga, equality and sharing, the fairness system. And the function of this domain is fairness, reciprocity, and mutualism. It enables people to form cooperative relationships instead of exploitative ones, and it's linked to the need for justice in the social domain. Personality domain is honesty, humility, which is linked to equity, anti-exploitation, and integrity. And important theory here is reciprocal cooperation or reciprocal altruism. So in social species, there's these three key processes which are necessary. First, there needs to be desire for cooperation. There needs to be guarding against exploitation. There needs to be forgiveness to repair ruptures. All appropriately bounded to the situation. All can be individually problematic. For example, people too locked into guarding to cooperate, or people locked onto a sense of injustice rather than forgiving, or forgiving too quickly such that people become hurt again. So that's the nature of cooperation, these three processes. Hierarchies, despite the term equality here, hierarchies accepted, for example, leadership, mentoring, if there's sufficient mutual benefit, and problems arise if there is not. Potentially maladaptive extremes of this then: low honesty, humility, where others are neglected; exploitation, coercion, aggression; traits of narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and too high honesty, humility, where the self is neglected, leading to subservience and victimization. High social inequality, be that economic or in other ways, it negatively impacts health, trust, and social cohesion. Some therapeutic interventions, assertiveness training. The criminal justice system is often involved for serious exploiters, for example, the Good Lives model, risk needs responsivity. And of course, systematic reforms for problematic structural inequalities beyond what we can do in individual therapy, but important for us to advocate for where we have good evidence that this is problematic. The second social domain, aroha, altruism, caring, kindness system. So the function of this domain is kindness and caring for others, prerequisite, which is care for self, requiring recognition and response to mental states. Attachment is the fundamental basis for optimal development of all other phenotype domains, hence its centrality. Personality domain is agreeableness. It's linked to empathy, theory of mind, mentalizing, and social cognition in general. And an important point I make in the paper here is that of implicit fitness, that life's algorithms are driven by this and not individual survival, meaning the propagation of shared genes through kin, the origin of our word kindness. And this is such an important factor, I devote a special section of the article to this. So Peter Gluckman, New Zealand's recent chief science advisor, authored an article arguing for the importance of this in medicine. Same applies for psychology, maybe even more so due to the implications for understanding self-sacrifice, self-destruction, conflict. So really important concept. Some potentially maladaptive extremes here then. Deficits in recognizing or responding kindly to mental states. So inconsiderateness, criticalness, asociality, autism, one end, the social aspect of autism that is, or excessive altruism. So hyper-empathizing, over-agreeableness, Williams syndrome, and autism being interesting opposites in a way. There's also in the personality disorders, which would be more accurately termed personal disorders, the feature of poor calibration and switching you can see between criticalness, rejection, to over-agreeing and idealizing in some psychophenotypic patterns. Examples of therapeutic interventions. So across therapies, the therapist is acting as an attachment figure, providing this secure base to explore different ways of being in the world. A helpful guide and ally in doing that. Mentalizing therapy, compassion-focused therapy, both focus a lot on this domain. Lastly, we have the two emotional systems, starting with courage, defending, threat system. So the function of this system is defense and avoidance and overcoming of threats. The core human need is safety from threats, being able to experience and manage threat-relevant emotions and reactions. This is the domain of neuroticism or reverse neuroticism and emotional stability, often reversed and called reverse neuroticism, just so that its poles align the same as the other personality traits. So we have things like fight, flight, freeze, forbearance strategies. And the problems here are not the strategy, but just it's matched the situation and when it becomes mismatched. So avoidance when approach is needed, for example, or vice versa. Problems here. So this is a huge category of difficulties and patterns. And most of these fall in the too low end, where there's too low a threshold for threat reactivity, an overwhelm of anxiety, anger, traumatic stress. But you can also have the too high threshold for threat reactivity with apathy, recklessness, risk-taking, Hierachical disease, which is a condition where your amygdala is attacked by this, so you don't process fear well. And examples of therapeutic interventions, well, speaking of an integrative approach, here we have the Unified Protocol for Emotional Disorders by Barlow, which provides psychoeducation about the threat system, correction of misappraisals, particularly catastrophizing and overestimation, stopping avoidance, and exposure and opposite action, all matched to the particulars of the mismatched threat reaction. And open transcending the reward system. So a core human need is that for growth, hope, purpose, transcending what is for what could be. And this is the personality domain of extroversion linked to positive affect, activation, reward sensitivity. And a debate in the personality literature concerns the role of sociality here, because high sociability correlates with high levels of extroversion, but the position I favor here is that that's because human incentives are so often social, but the core of this is positive affect as an RDoC, which can also be associated with non-social reward. So some people have this higher positive affect, but it's linked to task engagement or idea engagement, not just sociality. I also spend some time in the paper looking at the advantages of low positive emotions, which tend to get a bit of a bad rap. So, for example, withdrawal allows energy reallocation to cognitive and goal remapping, as occurs in grieving, where a lost person or part of your life needs to be accounted for and your goals remapped. It can also facilitate disengagement from exploitative social dynamics. And there's the phenomenon of depressive realism and greater accuracy that can occur sometimes. Maladaptive extremes then, too low positive affect, anhedonia, melancholia, withdrawal, and too high euphoria, grandiosity, mania. What are some examples of therapeutic interventions? Clarifying goals and values. For example, here we have the tikanga or other value card sorts available. Aligning your actions with personal strengths and context, and fostering adaptive pursuit of meaningful needs. Of course, there's for mania psychophenotypes, you can have social rhythm therapy and related interventions. So that's the 6 domains, in much more detail on them in the paper. That's an introduction to them. What I suggest then is that this integration of personality, culture, psychopathology, biology, and function into these 6 core psychophenotype domains is helpful, is providing a guide from which you can then go into as much detail as you like. In these domains, you might characterize them as being ultimate, meaning their core evolved survival functions, and in the ultimate in the ethological sense of having long evolutionary phylogenies in this role. They're universal, meaning they're valued across cultures, and they're unavoidable, meaning you need to develop each of these domains to a minimum degree to survive, to a higher level to thrive. I believe a 6-factor personality model is a more robust foundation empirically and theoretically for psychology and psychiatry than DSM, ICD categories. It better matches also systems of language, cultural traditions, and meaning. It has mattered to our species, arguably, ever since we developed language, perhaps as long ago as 250,000 years. And also, most psychopathology reflects extreme or ecologically mismatched variation of these psychophenotype domains. What then would be some training and practice implications here? Further emphasis on over-specified DSM-ICD categories, which leading professional bodies increasingly recognise as scientifically and clinically limiting, and instead specific psychophenotypic variations should be focused on their function, what the context is, and how they relate to aura well-being. Existing psychometrics can inform formulation of these domains and thresholds for service access. This matches psychologists' practice of clinical formulation already, and that's only strengthened by knowledge and structure described in this article. So I hope this talk and paper contributes to this reflection on how our knowledge may cohere, how pieces fit, and our understanding and nurturing of what matters most. Here's the paper. Here's the contact email. Aio, pono, aroha, ki te tangata. Thank you.